Just in time for the holidays, there are 3 new items in the horse's store. Check it out at www.horses.land. Genghis Khan's life was steeped in blood from the very beginning. The Khan's birth was celebrated with a human sacrifice. At just 10 years old, Genghis Khan murdered his own brother. Born an impoverished peasant and left to die by his clan, the Khan went on to conquer an area larger than the continent of Africa through an unending pursuit of ruthless total victory. His efforts made the accomplishments of Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and Napoleon look like child's play. In fact, history only offers us one other individual who, born a peasant, rose to reshape the entirety of humanity around him. That is Jesus of Nazareth, perhaps Genghis Khan's only true equal. Genghis Khan has been deservedly called the most important man of the millennium. He impacted the world in ways we still feel today. The Great Khan fundamentally and permanently altered the world system, and there is even a rumor that 1% of the global population is related to Genghis Khan. We will discuss this fact and so much more later in this video. You see, Genghis Khan was not a bloodthirsty maniac. Indeed, throughout his life, he displayed qualities of kindness and open-mindedness that we would all aspire to possess. But the questions remain outstanding. Who was Genghis Khan? Further, how and why did an illiterate, impoverished peasant conquer the world? This essay is not a play-by-play of Genghis's life. We will not be regarding every event and conquest and battle, but instead examining Genghis Khan the man, his methodologies, and his motivations. We will determine how he was able to soar to such great heights. In doing so, we will indeed learn much about the events of his life along the way. But to begin, we should get a simple understanding of Genghis Khan's story, even if in broad strokes. Genghis Khan was born as Temujin in about 1162. In Mongolian tradition, a child could inherit the power of a captured chieftain if that chieftain was slain, and the child given his name. Temujin's father, Yasugi, did just that. He had captured a Tartar leader and likely celebrated the birth of his son with a ceremonial human sacrifice. The boy was brought up in the traditional Mongol way. He learned archery, horseback riding, and hunting in his early years. Temujin's early childhood was mostly unremarkable, but this changed radically on his 12th birthday when his father was killed. After the death of Yasuge, Temujin's clan did not have the resources to feed and take care of the now fatherless family. So they essentially exiled Temujin, his mother, and his brothers. The family was stripped of their possessions and genuinely, simply left to die on the Mongolian steppe. The eldest brother of a Mongol family was like the household emperor. Of course, this sort of despotic role would do very little in the aims of sheer survival. Perhaps Temujin perceived this, or perhaps he had just had enough of his older brother Begtur. One day, Temujin caught a large fish and Begtur stole it. Begtur cooked the fish entirely for himself rather than sharing it with the family. So in his first act of brutality, Temujin shot Begtur full of arrows, killing his own brother. Temujin was just 10 years old at the time. After the murder, Temujin was arrested by a Mongol leader named Targutai. Targutai captured the boy and held him in a sort of restrictive wooden collar. But Targutai issued only one soldier to guard the prisoner. One night, the captive Temujin snuck up on his guard, clubbed him in the head, and made his escape into the night air. When he arrived back to his family, they were only barely surviving. They remained penniless and without food. Never one to be ruled by circumstance, Temujin spent the next years building himself into a young Mongol warlord. This eventually led to Temujin meeting his first wife, a young woman named Borte. The two were very much in love. It would prove to be the greatest love of Temujin's life. However, tragedy struck when Borte was kidnapped by a group of rival Mongols. This incident became the impetus for Temujin to grow from fledgling warlord to outright leader of men. Still a teenager, Temujin rallied clans of Mongols to go reclaim Borte. The success he had in these efforts was remarkable. The official Mongol historical claim is that Temujin led 500,000 men to go reclaim his wife. This is surely exaggerated, but the coalition Temujin assembled was immense. The preceding battle was a full, total, outright victory for Temujin, one which resulted in him saving Borte. But when he reunited with his wife, she was pregnant with another man's child. Showing great integrity, Temujin declared that she was his wife, and so the child was his son. Indeed, Temujin would go on to raise this child as his own. Temujin would have liked to simply return home with Borte, retire from warlording, and live a quiet pastoral life. But by this time he was just in too deep. He had pledged lifelong alliance to other leaders and had a veritable army of men acting under his own banner. Retirement just wasn't an option. Furthermore, Temujin had within him a red-hot sense of ambition. Even as a teenager, he was aiming towards entire supremacy over the Mongols. Temujin led his newfound army all over the steppe in an effective and ambitious plan to eliminate all of his rivals. The actions which followed and surrounded these conquests were brutal. Indeed, the word genocidal could accurately describe Temujin as his hordes swept through Asia. He was entirely successful in his pursuits. He was soon affirmed with the title Genghis Khan, which meant something like universal ruler. In the decades which followed, the new Khan would conquer land in a way humanity had never conceived. But how? How was an impoverished, illiterate peasant able to conquer an entire continent? This comes down to three things: the Khan's personal qualities, his incredible military genius, and his innate ability to operate a society. Throughout history, a lot of people have been conquerors. A lot of people wiped out massive populations, took land, and secured their spots in the canon of humanity. But Genghis Khan is singular. He is unlike any to have come before, and probably to ever come again. The Han had what we would call talent. Some can sing, some can dance, and others can build nations. But in Mongolia, there is a spiritual idea which says we all have a wild horse inside of us, a sort of spirit animal. In life, we must learn how to tame and ride this horse so that we can be propelled to our highest potential. Many people spend their whole lives trying to tame this horse and failing to do so. Consider the types of individuals who possess endless, never-to-be-fulfilled plans and ambitions. Genghis Khan, to the Mongols, had mastered his wild horse on a truly profound level. Of course, we can look to less abstract personal qualities to better understand the man himself. Genghis Khan placed a tremendous importance on loyalty. He practically started a small war to reclaim his first wife, Borte. Although he took many other wives throughout his life, as was custom, Genghis remained married to Borte until he died. This loyalty bled through to his life as a conqueror as well. Genghis Khan spent part of his life fighting against a man named Jamuka. When it seemed clear that Khan would emerge victorious, Jamuka's men turned him over to Genghis Khan and surrendered themselves. In response, the Han killed all of Jamuka's men as punishment for disloyalty to their own leader. This loyalty was not just to the individual, but to the Han's law and word. Under Han's law, if a city capitulated to the Mongols, they would be unharmed. In one instance, he found out that one of his sons had robbed a citizen from a city who had surrendered to the Han's forces. Genghis stripped that son of his rank in the military and demoted him to the lowest position in the army. He forced his son to fight on the frontmost line of the next battle, and the son was quickly killed. Above most other things, Genghis Khan was resilient. Indeed, he had this resilience in his very blood. He was left on the steppe to die, and yet through sheer grit and under the tutelage of his mother, the Han did so much more than survive. Throughout his career, Genghis Khan suffered setback after setback, but he never suffered destruction. The Han identified his weaknesses and faults, corrected them, and continuously pushed forward. Even when he should have been on his deathbed, succumbing to internal bleeding from a fall from his horse, Genghis Khan fought on. He continued to raid and conquer through Asia. Genghis Khan was too immensely charismatic. He had a lifelong tendency to listen to the opinions of others, and he generally was quite a good judge of character and intention. Whatever kindness was issued to the Han was typically repaid, and then some. This was in no small part how Genghis was able to repeatedly rally men and even armies to his own banner. The Han was too a generous man. In one famous incident, he saw a peasant laboring in the sun on a hot summer's day. Struck by empathy, Genghis Khan issued a pardon to the peasant, freeing him immediately for life from all taxes and forced labor. In another episode, Genghis's hordes won a battle with an enemy city. The adolescent son of the city's governor managed to save his own home. The young boy told Genghis that the governor wanted to surrender rather than fight, but had been overruled by his military. The Han immediately adopted the now fatherless boy. Genghis Khan was a conqueror. He killed many, many people and razed hundreds of cities. But even still, the Han was not considered remarkably or especially cruel in his time. When we look at other figures in history, like Henry VIII, who were perceived as bloodthirsty maniacs by their contemporaries, we find a remarkable distance from the Han. Even the Han's closest neighbors, the Persians and Jin Chinese, had reputations for immense cruelty, which Genghis did not. Up to this point, we have an idealized image of Genghis Khan. With the aforementioned profile, the Han who emerges is a resilient, loyal, charismatic figure with no small amount of goodwill. But this is only a partially accurate version of the man. There isn't a lot to suggest that Genghis Khan was himself a gifted soldier. Instead, his success in warfare came from his ability to recognize and organize talent. He had an incredible collection of generals and an uncanny ability to deploy them appropriately. Perhaps this is not the most damning quality to have. One could argue it is mostly good. The Han was presumably able to see his own faults and work around them. Certainly his lack of talent as a soldier never slowed down his conquering ambitions. The Han often found victory through outright treachery or outsmarting his opponent. He employed an array of clever psychological trickery in his warfare, and on more than one occasion sheer luck seemed to be well on his side. Indeed, the original Mongolian text which tells us of the Han's life goes to great lengths to communicate this idea, to tell us that planning, cunning, and simple good luck were all critical to Genghis's success. The Han was intensely paranoid. As the historian Frank McLynn has noted, Genghis's, quote, attitude towards his own kin was suspicious at best and malevolent at worst. Genghis devoted significant amounts of time to uncovering conspiratorial plots amongst his men, only a few of which turned out to be genuine. In one instance, Genghis executed 12 of his soldiers out of suspicion that one of them might have been disloyal. He was also prepared to kill one of his own brothers without trial after a series of vague rumors and accusations. The Han's paranoia unfortunately paired with regular bouts of uncontrollable, unprovoked rage. These episodes were often focused on his own men. In the 1220s, the Han hired a scribe and dictated a letter which was to be sent to Persia. The scribe was something of a diplomat and a master of the Persian language and culture. So he paraphrased the Han's words, adding in Persian colloquialisms and a tone of necessary flattery to its recipient. Genghis had the letter translated into Mongolian and read back to him. Upon discovering the scribe's stylistic choices, which were again reasonable, the Han called the scribe a traitor and had him immediately executed. In another incident, Genghis Khan suspected one of his wives of being unfaithful, and he immediately had her tortured, nearly to death, on the suspicion alone. These outbursts of rage were made even more unjustifiable by Genghis's insistence that his men remain forever stoic. The Han, in fact, had a standing law which specifically required the Mongol forces to not show their emotions. When one of the Han's sons suffered the loss of his child, Genghis prohibited him from any kind of outward mourning. Last, although certainly not least, Genghis Khan was a murderer of men. We are right to couch this label in the context of his time and his status as a conqueror. It is also true that his tendency for brutality was not especially remarkable by the standards of his time. But the fact remains that Genghis Khan is responsible for millions of deaths. We will later examine this number in a more precise way, but for now, as we discuss the Han's less agreeable traits, his mass murdering must be considered. There are a few incidents which speak to the Han's prodigious use of violence. It is said that Genghis once poured molten lead into the mouth of a conquered governor. There is also a tale which says as the Khan was raiding a rival clan, an old woman swallowed some valuable pearls to prevent Genghis from taking them. The Han proceeded to slice her open and retrieve the pearls from her dead body. While either of these specific events may be legend or fact, Genghis was never one to shy away from brutality. So in fact, the Han was neither an amiable, empathetic leader or a rage-fueled maniac. He was perhaps both. As we examine his strategies on the battlefield, we can see how his complex personality lent remarkably well to his warring ambitions. In battle, Genghis Khan's strategy was based on total victory. Warfare as he saw it was not some sporting affair wherein two parties needed to abide by a set of rules. It was a quest for annihilation. As noted Han scholar Jack Weatherford has said, quote, "Victory did not come to the one who played by the rules. It came to the one who made the rules and imposed them on his enemy." Before moving to conquer a city, Genghis Khan would announce that if his enemy surrendered, everyone would be safe. The invasion would be painless. The conquered city would just pay taxes to the Mongol Empire instead of their current leader, and life would go on as normal. Many cities took Genghis Khan up on this offer, and the conqueror never once broke his word. However, if the city resisted, Genghis Khan told them, they would all die. He would be ruthless, and he would wipe out anyone who even attempted hostility. Most remarkably, this included the wealthy aristocratic elites. At the time, the wartime killing of elite society was something of a taboo. The so-called civilized belief was, fine, kill the poor and the workers, but you can't kill the aristocrats. However, by the Han's estimation, these elites could not even defend themselves against the Mongols, so what use did he have for them in his empire? This approach, this willingness to break the rules of traditional warfare, painted Han as a barbarian in the eyes of his enemies, a label which has largely stuck with him in modernity. One problem was that the Han had a relatively small, roving army. He didn't really have administrators, so once his people left conquered cities, those citizens could revolt quite easily. If this happened, and it did on occasion, the Han turned his army around and killed all of the conquered people. Throughout the history of warfare, leaders have generally used the methods of war which are produced by their culture. These things present a sort of toolbox from which they operate in wartime. Mongols raided around the steppe and they fought one another, but as a people, they had never even conceived of continental domination. Genghis Khan himself was a nobody from nowhere with no conception of traditional warfare strategies by the Mongols or otherwise. So when he began to warlord through the continent, he was forced to become a true innovator. We can see this in one of his very first conquests. When the Han was a young warlord, he traveled to China. It was the first time he'd encountered a city. Given his background on the steppe, it was perhaps the first time he'd even seen a wall. The Han noticed the complex Chinese irrigation system by which the city had rechanneled a river. He thought if they could rechannel a river and use its great force for irrigation, he could rechannel a river to take down their walls. The Han had no weapons of war, so he told his man to start digging a canal towards the walls. This all went very poorly. The river flooded the Han's camp, but he repeated the tactic, and next time it worked, and it did tear down a city's walls. This was a pattern. Genghis Khan truly learned from his enemies and his failures. The Han never believed himself so omniscient that there was nothing he could be taught. He took blame for his failures, and he did not repeat them. But much more so than innovation, the Han's tendency to assimilate was a major source of his success. He didn't really develop new weapons at all. Instead, Genghis Khan took from a diverse group of people. When he encountered a strategy or tool which could serve his army, the Han incorporated it into his forces. This led to a diverse amalgamation of weapons within the Mongol army, all borrowed from disparate cultures, but now used for the first time under a single leader. The Mongols had siege weapons like catapults, trebuchets, and mangonels to hurl stones at enemies, but they also used these devices to throw pots of burning fuel, explosives, and flammable liquids which would be ignited by flaming arrows. They built massive crossbows on wheels. The Mongols pushed portable towers for long-range attacks. All the while, Mongol soldiers dug beneath the earth to engage in a sort of proto-trench warfare. To serve both function and psychological warfare, Mongols piled captured soldiers into enemy moats as human bridges over which they could push wheeled weapons. This was how the Han won, all-out, ruthless onslaught. One victim of a Mongol invasion described the events as, quote, a red-hot furnace fed from without by hard sticks thrust into the recesses, while from the belly of the furnace sparks shoot into the air, before his men were quickly, quote, drowned in the sea of annihilation. Now, it's tempting to think that the Mongols were pure bronze, a horde of simple brute force terror. But this isn't quite true. The Han also engaged heavily in psychological warfare. For example, before approaching a city, the Mongols would deploy a few messengers to the area who would spend weeks spreading rumors about the size and brutality of the Mongolian army. On some occasions, the Han would instruct his men to light 4 or 5 fires each at camp nightfall. This would make it appear as if the soon invading forces were several times larger than they really were. It would be an understatement to say that the Mongols were and still are incredible equestrians. They were all but raised on horseback, and by the time a Mongol child reached adolescence, he was an expert horseman. The Han put this skill to great use on the battlefield. In battle, Mongolians employed a technique of rapid movement, assaulting the enemy from all sides on horseback, which made the Mongol army appear much larger than a traditional formation. The Han also had a strategy wherein a group of men on horseback would ride far back from the battlefield and speed towards the conflict. This gave the impression the Mongols had incoming reinforcements, demoralizing and panicking the enemy. The Han even employed psychological warfare in the weapons he used. The Mongolians developed a type of arrow with perforations in the arrowhead which amplified the whistling sound they made as they flew through the air. As enemies ducked for cover, they could only hear the arrows, and such a cacophony fraudulently promised that thousands more were on the way. Just this threat could cause enemies to break formation, making it easy for the Mongols to decimate in battle. Another moment of the Han's brilliance came when the Mongols set out to attack the walled city of Ryazan. By this time, the Mongols had a huge number of laborers in their forces. These men cut down trees, transported them to Mongol lines, and built a new wall which completely surrounded the already walled enemy city. The Mongol construction prevented the city's defenders from sending out troops or destroying any of the Han's siege machines. It also stopped any reinforcements or supplies from entering the city. The people in Ryazan were trapped and stricken with the horrifying reality that there was absolutely no way to escape. Furthermore, the enemy could not even see the Mongol attack as it came. Indeed, the Mongols proceeded to take the city with ease, using ranged weapons and siege machines from behind their wall. Personal qualities and warfare talent were fine, but the Han also needed to maintain order in his newly conquered lands. Certainly without prosperity, his empire would have been radically short-lived. But fortunately for the Mongols, the Han's talent indeed appeared again. I think one of the most profoundly true things about Genghis Khan was his practicality. He did not quest for personal greatness or material gain. Instead, he wished only for the prosperity of his people. This was expressed in virtually every decision he made for the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan was a deeply religious man throughout his life, ascribing to a sort of Mongolian shaman tradition. He worshipped the mountain on which he was born and that same sky above his birthplace. Although his specific religious beliefs grew and changed through his life, Genghis would regularly return to this mountain and pray in solitude for days at a time. Despite his relatively strict religious beliefs, Genghis Khan granted religious freedom to everyone in his empire. Like you will see with so many of his policies, this was not out of some humanitarian altruism. Instead, it was simply to reduce conflict and infighting within the empire. It was also a way to attract people to life under the Mongol banner. Cities in the Mongol Empire were some of the most religiously free in the world. Genghis Khan even held debates wherein religious leaders could discuss theological issues. These subjects included good versus evil, the nature of God, and the prospect of an afterlife. Importantly, these debates never really had winners. The Khan believed, in his words, that each religion was like the finger of a hand. Mankind was better off with all represented and intact. There is a modern sort of rumor that the Khan mandated women's rights in his empire. This is true, but again, not out of any altruism or proto-feminism. Kidnapping women and taking them for wives was, for a long time, a traditional part of the Mongol society. But Genghis Khan identified, and indeed knew firsthand, that this caused little more than infighting. Someone kidnapped a wife, retaliation came, then retaliation for retaliation, etc., etc. So one of the Khan's first laws was to prohibit the sale and kidnapping of women. This was purely practical. It was an effort, and an effective one, to reduce warfare amongst disparate Mongol tribes. These types of social developments were largely functional, rather than built out of principle. But Genghis Khan was, too, an immensely principled leader. One of his strongest beliefs was in merit. Genghis ensured that to live, work, or fight in the Mongol Empire was to exist in a pure meritocracy. Being a man from nowhere and nothing himself, Genghis perceived that it was not the birth of an individual that mattered, but the capability. If a captured city did not capitulate, all of those who resisted would die. However, the Khan spared skilled workers like merchants, scribes, and basket weavers. Unskilled people who had not resisted his invasion were put to work in dangerous military construction roles. Genghis Khan had no interest whatsoever in material gains, famously saying, quote, "I wear the same clothing and eat the same food as the cow herds and horse herders. We make the same sacrifices, and we share the riches." In a more succinct quote, Genghis Khan expressed his opinion on the matter, saying, "I hate luxury." This was more than just aesthetics for Genghis. He once declared that the eternal blue sky had condemned those people he conquered because of their, quote, haughtiness and their extravagant luxury. And like most other ideals, this disdain for luxury had a functional purpose in the Khan's empire. While he had no interest in personal wealth, the Khan wanted to make the Mongolian Empire prosperous. He believed that the exchange of money and goods was the best way to ensure prosperity for a people. Of course, massive fortune came his way as he conquered throughout Asia, but Genghis Khan simply gave it all away. He believed that the circulation of riches would help his empire more than him just accumulating wealth. Indeed, much of his conquering was in this interest, rather than personal glory or greed. For example, Genghis Khan saw the tremendous wealth that was in circulation via the now famous Silk Road in China. He wanted this trade route to fuel the Mongols, wanted his empire to be the beneficiary of all this commerce. So he tried several times to draft trade agreements with the Chinese. They repeatedly broke each of these agreements, and so seeing that it was the only way to control Chinese trade, Genghis Khan conquered the nation of China. Merchants also had a tremendous role in Genghis's empire. Along Mongolian trade routes, Genghis set up small stands where merchants could receive free food and horses for their journey. When he conquered hostile cities, merchants were rarely executed, but instead assigned to work within the Mongol Empire. So we now know of Genghis Khan as he lived, breathed, conquered, and ruled. But what of the Han in death? What did he leave humanity? In 1227, Genghis Khan was riding on horseback, hunting wild horses in the Gobi. The Han was on a particularly temperamental horse, which bucked suddenly and threw him to the ground. This caused some sort of internal injury to the Han, who quickly came down with a serious fever. The Han refused medical care, instead continuing with his conquests across Asia. 6 months after the accident, Genghis Khan succumbed to his injuries and died. Details on the place and circumstances are mostly unknown. Historical record basically stops with the fall from his horse. Certainly, historical events and figures are always subject to perspectives, debate, and disagreement, but there can be little doubt that Genghis Khan was the single greatest conqueror our world has ever seen. Historian Frank McLynn offers a staggering description of the Han's empire. Genghis Khan and his sons vanquished peoples from the Adriatic to the Pacific. The Mongols eventually reached Austria, Finland, Croatia, Hungary, Poland, Vietnam, Burma, Japan, and Indonesia. His empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Arctic Ocean. Mongol influence extended as far as Mali in Africa. The Mongol Empire covered 12 million contiguous square miles, an area as large as Africa and bigger than North America. By contrast, the extent of the Roman Empire was about half that of the continental USA. By 1240, Mongol conquests covered most of the known world, and even at Genghis's death in 1227, embraced more than half of this world. The modern population of the countries ruled by the empire at its greatest extent contain 3 billion of the world's 7 billion population. Consider, as McLynn notes, that this all came from nothing. Alexander the Great's father built a military apparatus for him. Julius Caesar entered the world with 3 centuries of Roman military dominance to call upon. Even Napoleon came from a long line of advanced military tradition. Genghis Khan was born in a tent. Alexander the Great's teacher was none other than Aristotle. Julius Caesar was taught by the Roman education system, which was the greatest humanity had to offer. Napoleon could and did find wisdom in the mass of European Romantic era works. Genghis Khan never learned to read or write. Genghis Khan did not just bring his nomadic people to near global domination. He recognized that this was even possible, despite there being absolutely nothing to indicate as much. The conqueror invented a culture and solved massive, unforeseen societal and political problems from nothing but thin air and force of will. In a time when xenophobia was ingrained into the mind of humanity, Genghis Khan was unshackled by the fear of the other. He embraced new ideas, tactics, and cultures, both out of conquering ambition and pure personal interest. Genghis Khan was an awesome man. His deeds were too awesome, in the most terrible and violent sense of the word. There has been much conversation and study about the Mongols' violence, specifically what amount of death they can be credited with. Of course, as to be expected, there exist extremes in thought. Some say the Mongols' death counts have been overblown to absurdity, while others would be happy to rank them generationally in the billions. It's very difficult to say how many people the Mongols really killed under Genghis Khan's reign. As a general rule, determining wartime death counts is always difficult. Even recent conflicts provide us with estimates and often wide ranges. This becomes even more complicated when we examine historical peoples. Ancient sources multiply death counts for the sake of propaganda in one direction or the other. Meanwhile, contemporary scholars are often too conservative, sometimes letting skepticism pull their numbers into outright falsehood. Death counts, further, are generally predicated on reliable population statistics. Ancient sources certainly do not provide these. We will turn again to the historian McLynn. If you would like to see the entirety of his methodology, it is on screen now. Taking into account all of the known events and populations, McLynn puts the Mongol death toll in Russia and Europe somewhere near 1 million. After adding this in with the much more significant Asian events and minor wars, McLynn gets to his total number. By his educated estimate, Genghis Khan was responsible for a truly astounding 37.5 million deaths. One of the Han's closest advisors once described the Mongol warfare strategy as this: "The basis of the state is the people. If, when a country has been conquered, the population is then murdered, what advantage does the state have? Moreover, if the innocent are killed, this simply stiffens the enemy's will to resist. This is not in accord with the leader's wishes." This would seem to fly in the face of the Mongols' massive death toll, but we must remember the Han's everlasting surrender or die policy. The early Mongol army and population were relatively small. As such, they were very likely concerned with their own numbers, with sustaining. A complete and utter decimation of the enemy would have been the best way to reduce Mongol casualties. Further, the Mongols basically saw Genghis Khan as having a divine right. In Mongol legend, he was the product of an immaculate conception. The Han was literally heaven sent to bring the Mongol people to their apex. Resisting the Mongol hordes was basically resisting God himself. It was an act of blasphemy. With this in mind, it's easy to imagine why the Mongols were so willing to kill. While there's nothing to suggest that Genghis Khan propagandized or exalted himself as some divine being, it was certainly a motivating idea within his forces. Now, even by ancient standards, it is difficult to justify the massacre of nearly 40 million people. By modern thought, this is impossible to justify. But certainly the Han was a mostly pragmatic man. He did not kill for the sake of killing, and indeed his brutality had both function and results, some of which can certainly be described as positive. Many scholars believe that the Han ushered in an era called the Pax Mongolica, which was a long-lasting peace and prosperity in Eurasia. During this time, it was said that you could travel from Palestine to Mongolia with a gold plate on your head and not be bothered. Other historians believe that this Pax Mongolica was either a very short-lived peace or, in fact, did not happen at all. Regardless of this disagreement, it can be said with certainty that the Mongol Empire single-handedly linked two continents together in a way which proved to be permanent. During the Crusades, Europe had come into contact with the Islamic world, but still European presence and influence functionally ended at Jerusalem. As Genghis Khan conquered China, he was becoming convinced that agriculture would generate more prosperity for his empire than nomadism. The Mongols would grow crops and trade them along a massive network of trade routes, including those which led to the Islamic world, which now had some European presence. So the Han brought Asia into contact with the Middle East and thus with Europe. This is more than just retrospective theory. At various times there were Mongolian envoys present in France and England, and French workers operating in the Mongol capital. The Han's trade routes and the commerce which flowed on them were so great they essentially held the very system of the world together. The knowledge of firearms, silk, ceramics, and woodblock printing all came to Europe from Asia on trade routes propagated by Genghis Khan himself. Unfortunately, the Han's propensity for trade had negative effects as well. Rinderpest is an animal disease similar to human measles. This illness wiped out huge amounts of livestock after being spread by Mongol conquests and trade. However, this pales in comparison to what recent research has revealed. Evidence of the Black Plague has been found in Central Asia, which predates the disease's European presence by a decade. It is very likely the Mongols or their trade routes spread the Black Plague to Europe. There's an often told rumor that some 0.5% or 1% or 2% of people alive today are descendants of Genghis Khan as a result of the Han's prodigious procreation. Historians and Mongol scholars widely reject this claim. The idea is made quite fraudulent when we consider that scientists have no DNA from Genghis Khan himself. There is no way to check if any DNA matches the Khan's because we don't have any of his. Genghis Khan was a famous man and he had many children, but these descendants were very well documented. As late as the 1500s, there was only one remaining male direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Then, when Mongolia fell under the rule of the USSR, the party killed every descendant of the Khan they could find. So, if anything, there has been a historical shortage of Genghis's blood in the centuries that followed his life. It should also be said that once the Mongols conquered China, they were forbidden from marrying the Chinese. More broadly, the Mongols generally married and had children with one another. They did not really procreate with conquered people. While we can't say this precludes exceptions, intercourse, or law-breaking, it certainly puts a dent in the idea of mass breeding on the part of the Mongols. The study which originally revealed this ostensible factoid does not actually support its own conclusion either. The participating scientists did find a genetic marker in common throughout 8 million men in Central Asia, but they didn't find evidence to indicate that this marker came from Genghis Khan. The claim represents an enormous leap in logic to say that because this trait is shared and Asian, it must have come from the Han. Indeed, more recent studies have completely disproven this whole theory. The Mongol Empire was truly a doomed venture. The Mongols were a few people. At the empire's height, the ratio of Mongols to conquered peoples was 1 to 100. The sheer weight of this population meant that the empire was simply too large for the Mongols to maintain indefinitely. With such an outsized number of subjects to rulers, rebellion would mean a certain victory for the captured population. Indeed, the Mongols' greatest weapon was in their agility and mobility. They were a pastoral force who moved quickly around land on horseback. It became clear that agriculture and civilization were the way forward for an empire at this scale. So as the Mongols began to pursue this way of life and abandon their nomadism, they abandoned the very things which made them so effective. Indeed, the empire did eventually crumble, due to these factors and due to the Khan waning from his merit-based conviction at the end of his life. He turned his empire over to his sons, who proved to lack much of the great Khan's leadership abilities. Genghis Khan is a man today with many reputations. To some, he was a genocidal barbarian who brought waves of blood across the world. For others, he was a great man who united millions of disparate people and paved the way for Asia as it exists today. In fact, he is both, and he is everything in between. Born an anonymous, illiterate peasant, Genghis Khan went on to build the largest empire humankind has ever seen in just a few short decades. But he did this through ruthlessly massacring millions of people. So indeed, as it often goes in history, the greatest men are too the most terrible.